I'm Jeff Oak, and welcome to Taking Care of Your Business Conversations to support small and medium-sized businesses. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to have David Friedman. David is a speaker and an author, internationally known on the topic of culture. And let me tell you, you're in for a real treat. All of the lessons David's going to share with us are really born out of his experience as a CEO of a company. So, David, tell us a little bit about yourself. How'd you get into this background, this culture stuff?
Sure, Jeff. It's great to be with you this morning. So, a little background here. I'm in the Philadelphia area, and I spent about 27 years as the CEO of a company. It was an employee benefits consulting company, and I grew that company from when I started. It was two of us. And when I eventually sold the company a number of years later, we had about 110 people. And during the years that I was growing that company, it was a very successful company, I'm proud to say. But I would tell you that virtually all of our success was based on the culture that we had built in the company. It was, wow. It's why people came to work for us. It's why it was everything. And as the CEO of the company, I did a lot of things to purposely create that kind of culture. Right. I eventually ended up selling the company to a large multi-billion-dollar publicly held company, retired from that industry, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do next. I was too young to really be retired, but I ended up writing a book about the things that we had done from a culture perspective that made us so successful. And that book was called Fundamentally Different. And I wrote that book. I'm always very honest about this. I wrote that book actually as a closure step, as a way of wrapping up my old career in a nice bow, putting it behind me so I could go do something totally and completely different. Wasn't expecting to launch something. But what ended up happening is people read the book and they got a lot of value from it. And I had a former client of my old company who happened to be in a Vistage group in Southern New Jersey. And he said, you should come and speak to our Vistage group. I didn't even know what Vistage was, but I like talking about this stuff, as you'll tell. And so I went and I spoke to that group. And next thing I knew, I started getting asked to speak to other groups. And as people heard me speak, people said, hey, can I hire you to help me do that in my company? And I was off to the races. And so over the last 8 or 9 years, I've done close to 700 workshops on this material. I've written 3 books on it. I've built another company called CultureWise that has helped hundreds. I think we've worked with probably 500 companies, helping them implement the methodology that I created. My kids tell me I completely failed at the retirement game. I didn't do that very well. But I always share that background to say that everything that I teach people comes, as you noted, from my experience as a CEO, having created it all in my own company and having taught it to so many thousands of leaders. It's just really practical stuff, but it's very organic.
It's a wonderful story. And as a Vistage chair, I can say that you are one of the hottest speakers on the Vistage circuit, which is why we're so delighted to have you today. So there's a lot of talk about culture. It's a hot topic. Yeah. A lot of people are wanting to understand it. Why culture? Why that buzz? Why is culture so important?
It's interesting. I think there's sort of two pieces to the answer to that, Jeff. I think on one hand, the why currently, because really culture's always been important. It's just that lately people are paying attention to it. I think certainly the pandemic has had an effect on that people are worried about. We used to have a good culture and now our people are working remotely or we're hybrid environment and we're worried about keeping the culture that we used to have. We also know that given another impact of the pandemic is that everybody's struggling with a labor shortage. Every Vistage group I speak to, people are frustrated with they can't get materials, supply chain issues, and they can't find people to work. And so culture has an enormous influence on people's ability or companies' ability to attract the people they want and also their ability to retain them. So it's gotten more attention lately. But ultimately, it's always been really important. People just didn't realize it. And, I say that the culture in any organization has an enormous influence over just how people show up and do their job every day.
Sure.
I often describe people as fitting on a typical bell curve. That for our listeners, if you picture your company and you picture your employees, most of them will fit on a very typical bell curve. On one end of the spectrum, you're always going to have some great people. I call those people rock stars.
Sure.
You could put them anywhere and they'll be great.
Yeah.
And on the other end of the spectrum, we usually have 5 or 10% of our people who aren't very good. But in between,
no matter where you put them, they're not going to be.
No matter exactly, you put people in the middle. The 80% of our employees are going to be influenced significantly by the environment in which they're operating. In other words, if you put those people in a really high-performing environment, those people will look around consciously and unconsciously, and they'll figure, I guess that's what they expect around here. We want to fit in. And those people will raise their level of play to match what they see going on around them. And you take the exact same 80% of people in the middle, put the same people with whatever their skills, talent, knowledge, ability, experiences, put those people in a low-performing environment, those people will sink to the level of the people around them, because the environment that we're in, the culture, that's all that culture really is, the environment that we're operating in has just an enormous influence over how people show up and what they do every day.
So tell us how you did that. How did you build this amazing culture at your company?
I'm going to say it this way. This is because there's a distinction between what did I do in my first company and what have I learned.
Okay.
So what I would say is much of what I did in my first company was very intuitive. That I'm just fortunate that I had pretty good instincts for leadership. And there were a lot of things that I did largely intuitively to build a great culture. And it was in retrospect that, I'll say it this way. You hear people talk about learning from your failures. I think if you're reflective and introspective, you can learn just as much or more from your successes.
Sure.
And so most of what I did just was instinctive and it worked really well. But because I am introspective, I would do things and think, wow, that worked really well. I wonder why.
Yeah.
There must be some principles of leadership, of organizational behavior that are going on here. I didn't know them when I was doing them, but they exist.
Sure.
If I could stop and I could reflect on my experience and I could discern what some of those principles were that are at play, then I could start articulating them and I could start teaching it to the people around me so that we could start doing this stuff more intentionally instead of by accident, or just instead of relying strictly on my instincts. So over the course of my career, I built a whole body of material, mostly just out of my experience for how to do this. So when I was sitting down to write my first book, Fundamentally Different, I thought, well, what did I do? and so in retrospect, here's what I did. And so I put together, what I teach people today is there's a framework that I call the 8-step framework. 8 different steps. When you do these 8 things, this is how you systematically create and embed the culture that you want into every part of your company, whether your people are on site or whether they're remote or anything in between. And so there's this 8-step framework. And while all of the 8 steps are really important, ultimately, my experience has also shown me over all these years that there are probably 2, not even probably, there are 2 of the 8 steps that have a disproportionate amount of influence over success. In other words, if we do these 2 things well, we're going to be incredibly successful. And if we don't do these 2 things well, we're kidding ourselves. We're not going to get very far.
So dying to know, what are the 2 things?
All right, here we go. So step number 1 is we have to, and this is kind of obvious, but it's important. We've got to be able to define, well, what is the culture we want? And as obvious as that sounds, there has to be enough clarity to it. And my experience is that very few companies do this well. Almost every company you run into has some very typical vision, mission, set of core values. And yet my experience is that most of the stuff most of the time, that really isn't clear enough. We have to be clearer than that. So to do that, and this is a real core part of my teaching, I make a really big deal about the difference. It's a linguistic difference, but it's more than just semantics. A big deal about the difference between what I call values and what I call behaviors, because I think they're different from each other. And it's more than just semantics. So let me explain to your audience what's the difference between the two and why is it important. So a value to me is typically an abstract concept. So examples of values that people are familiar with: quality, integrity, loyalty, respect, teamwork, innovation, collaboration, service. These are values or concepts. Right. A behavior, in contrast, is an action. It's something I can actually see people doing. So some of the behaviors that I teach in my company are things like honor commitments. That's something you actually do. Practice blameless problem solving. Get clear on expectations. Be a fanatic about response time. Follow up on everything. These are actions that people do. Sure. So a value is, again, it's an abstract idea. Behavior is an action. And the reason, Jeff, that that's important, and not just semantics, is that the problem in my experience with most companies, not all, but most companies' traditional looking set of core values is that they tend to be so abstract that they mean too many different things to different people.
Right.
You know, what you mean by respect is different than what I mean by respect, or what you mean by service may be different than what I mean by service. And so it's really hard to coach somebody about their values. But I could coach them all day long about what I see them doing or not doing. So behaviors, because they're action oriented, end up being a lot easier to teach and coach and guide and give people feedback about. They're easier to operationalize. Right. So the first step in the process is that we've got to be able to define exactly what we want our culture to be with enough clarity. And I say, define it in terms of the behaviors that you say as a leader of your company. If I could get our people to do this more consistently, man, watch out, we'd be amazing. Right. And those are the behaviors that really you want to drive your culture.
It strikes me as I hear you talk, and I couldn't agree more about the abstractness of values versus the specificity of behaviors. The fact that values are abstract is pronounced in a workplace where there may be 4 generations, 3, 4, sometimes even 5 generations, where there's cultural diversity in terms of how people have been raised. Yeah. And so that the fact that a single value can mean many different things, it strikes me that in the current environment, even more so.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting on that point. Many years ago, I worked with a consultant. His name was Lloyd Fickett. Lloyd Fickett is a communication consultant, and he taught a series of practices that we taught in our company and are pretty much embedded into most of the work that I do these days, that were collectively called the collaborative way. And Lloyd had an interesting perspective on this, and it relates to the point you were just making. And he used to say that he used to call the collaborative way, his phrase for this was, he called it an invented way of relating. And the analogy that Lloyd used to give is, he said that imagine that that in your workplace, you've got not only different generations, but you've got people that come from all different countries, and they speak different languages. And so I grew up, I'm making this up, but I grew up in France, and I come into the workplace and I speak French, and somebody else is speaking German, and somebody Spanish, and somebody Japanese, and so on. It would be really hard for us to communicate. But if instead we said, you know what, I don't care where you came from. When we come into work, we speak Swahili there. And everybody, it doesn't matter what language you grew up with, we're going to speak Swahili. It would be a lot easier for us to work together. Right. And in a very analogous kind of way, creating a clear set of behaviors, and I'm going to use a phrase I'll define for your audience. I call these behaviors fundamentals because they're fundamental to success. So when you hear me say the word fundamental, just think behavior, just my name for a behavior. So when we develop a set of fundamentals for how we want to behave in this organization, that becomes a common language. And it doesn't matter like what you thought respect meant or what somebody else thought service, it doesn't matter. Here, when we come into work, this is the language we use. These are the behaviors, and here's what we mean by them, that everybody agrees this is how we're going to operate in our company. it's incredibly powerful to have that common
Right.
language.
Right. And as you say, very specific, very
Yes.
actionable, very visible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And that's what people, people want, they want and need that clarity.
sure.
And it's so interesting that so often when we think about, when you hear managers talk about their frustrations, we're usually frustrated that our people aren't being the way we want them to be. And we're just annoyed by that, except we usually haven't given them very clear expectations.
Right.
We either just get annoyed, or we have the very typical vague notion of values that we believe in. It's not that they're BS. We believe in them, but they just ultimately don't typically bring enough clarity so that people know what to expect.
Sure. And as a leader, I may have a specific idea of the behaviors I have in mind as it relates to, say, respect. But until I articulate it in the common language that you described, here's what respect looks like.
Yes.
In very specific behavioral ways. The whole notion of clarifying expectations, that's huge. That's huge.
It is. Now, here's an interesting thing about this whole behavioral thing. So some of your audience members, I'm sure, probably have taken their values and some of them have just left these vague, nebulous values, but some of them have sort of woken up to this behavior idea. And what some companies will do is they'll take their core values and kind of unpack them into behaviors. So in other words, we might say, I'm making this up, but let's say our core values were quality, excellence, teamwork, and respect. So what some companies might do, which will sound logical, except I'm going to then debunk this, is some companies will say, all right, well, what do we mean by respect? Well, we mean these behaviors. These are the behaviors that when I say respect, this is what I'm picturing. And what do we mean by excellence? Well, or quality? Well, these are the behaviors that define quality to me. And that's better than not doing that. So that at least starts to bring more clarity. But there's a subtle thing that people miss when they try to do it in that manner. And what they miss is that if we start with our core values, quality, excellence, respect, teamwork, whatever they are, and we then try to define our behaviors inside those, we're actually introducing a limiter or a constraint to our thinking, because the only behaviors we would consider would be the ones that tie directly to those values. But there might be some other behaviors that are really important to our success that don't necessarily fit into one of those boxes.
Sure.
And we would never think about them because we started by saying, here's our core values and here's the behaviors that fit inside them.
Right.
But there's other behaviors that could be really important.
And there's a bit of a mixed message too, or a dual message. Here's something very abstract, here's something very specific, instead of, as your model suggests, just starting with the specific.
I say just start with our behaviors.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, what's crazy about that, I say crazy just because it's unconventional, is I say to people, there's lots of ways you can do all of this. And I want to be clear for your audience that there's not one right way. My way isn't the right way or the wrong way. There are many ways that one can do it. There's just some things I've found to be more effective than others.
Right.
So the one approach is to create those values and then inside of that figure out our behaviors. The other approach is just go straight to the behaviors. And it sounds kind of crazy to say, do we even need to talk about the core values? Because that is so built into everybody's learning about running a business. You got to define your core values. It's really important. And I'm the crazy guy saying, I don't know about that. What I know is you need to have the behaviors. So in my company, we don't talk about any core values. It's not that I don't value anything. I just don't know what the utility is in articulating them.
Right.
As long as I've defined my behaviors, or as I call them, fundamentals, and we're practicing these fundamentals, we're being successful. So why do I need to define the core values?
And there are many people in the workplace who might say, well, of course I'm respectful. Of course I have integrity. Of course I strive for excellence. And in some cases, they might be offended that they're being told you got to do these values, when in fact, many people see themselves. But when you get to the behaviors, that's where like, well, I could do that a little better. I could do that a little more.
Yeah.
So I really like the gist
Yeah.
of what you're saying.
Yeah. So we've got to define, we've got to get that clarity. If we don't have the clarity, we're not going to go any further. I mean,
Right.
how do we know who to hire, who's going to be a good fit for our culture if we don't know what our culture is? How do we teach it? How do we coach it? So everything starts with that clarity. Now, once we've got that, the second step in this 8-step framework that I was describing is really game-changing and really simple. And I call it creating rituals. So a ritual to me, when I use that language for people, a ritual is a routine. It's something that we do over and over and over again until it becomes second nature. It just becomes embedded. So simple examples of rituals. You get up in the morning, you brush your teeth. You go to a ball game, we sing the national anthem. When I was a kid in school, we used to say the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. Some people before a meal, they say a prayer. They're just routines.
Yeah.
The reason that rituals are so important to success is that most people, it's just part of being human, most people are not very good. In fact, they stink at sticking with things. We all come up with the great ideas, and then we do them for a little while and they fall by the wayside. I always joke that, if I were to go to your area where you live in early January, I'll bet every gym in your region was probably mobbed, because this is the year we're going to get healthy. And then by February, they're back to their normal levels of activity.
Right.
And
right.
That's just how we are. And we roll out programs at work that we're sure are going to be game changing. And then we get really busy and they fall by the wayside.
Right.
So a ritual, when something becomes a ritual, it's not hard to do. Most of us don't struggle to remember to brush our teeth, I hope. It's just part of the routine. This is what we do. So here's how we can use that concept to our advantage. What we do is we take these fundamentals that I was describing, these behaviors, we roll it out to people, into the whole organization in highly interactive, engaged work sessions. And then we begin to focus on one of those fundamentals each week through a series of rituals. And I'll give you an example in just a moment. So week number 1, everybody in the company all week long is thinking about working on, focusing on, practicing fundamental number 1. The week after that, everybody in the company is focused on number 2. And the week after that, 3 and 4 and 5 and so on. When we get to the end of the list of fundamentals, we go back to the beginning and we just keep repeating it over and over and over again forever, because that's the only way it sinks in.
Right.
So let me give you an example of just one ritual to help your people kind of envision what this looks like. So one of the rituals that I do in my company, and pretty much every one of our clients, actually everyone, not even pretty much, every one of our clients, is every time we have a meeting in my company, whether it's a project team meeting, a department meeting, a leadership meeting, a Zoom meeting, doesn't have to be in person. If we have a meeting, we start every meeting with the first agenda item being the fundamental of the week. And we spend the first 3 to 5 minutes talking about it. So for example, in my company this week, my fundamental is one that we call be relentless about continuous improvement. It's about constantly looking at everything that we're doing and saying, how can we get better? And so I had a meeting with my team yesterday afternoon. And first thing we did is we spent a few minutes talking about that. So what can we do to be better? How come some people don't keep improving? Did you ever notice the fact, I find this kind of interesting, that those who are at the top of their profession are constantly finding things to get better at. And those who are pretty average usually can't find anything to improve. It's kind of interesting. So we just spent a few minutes talking about that. We don't want to take over the meeting, just a few minutes, and then we move on. But every meeting all week long, we're talking about that. So if you picture, any of our audience members, if you picture your company and think about all the meetings that take place in a given week in your company, and imagine if in every single one of those meetings, every one of your employees was talking about the same principle, that's a lot of teaching that's going on.
Sure.
And so if we do that this week for this week's fundamental, and next week, every meeting starts with next week's fundamental and so on, and we just keep cycling through them, sooner or later, these things start to become internalized.
Sure.
And so the simple idea, and there's 6 other steps to this 8-step framework that I was describing, and they cover things like, how do you hire people who will be a good fit for the culture that you're trying to create? How do you integrate or onboard the people you just hired? How do you coach people about it? How do you create accountability for it? So there are other things, but the core of it is this very, very simple idea that if we can define in really clear terms the behaviors that drive success in our organizations, and then we can create a structured, systematic way to teach those behaviors over and over and over and over and over again through the rituals, sooner or later, those behaviors are going to become internalized by our people, and they're just going to be the way that we operate around here.
Sure. And it becomes what some people I've heard define culture is the way we do things around here.
That's exactly it. It becomes the way it's just how we do things around here.
Sure.
And that's the whole point.
Yeah. To dig down on the fundamentals, in your experience, what's a good number? I could see a scenario where people only have, I don't know, like 3 behaviors, 3 fundamentals. And then I could see another scenario where like there are too many, like I don't know, 50 of them. What's a sweet spot?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jeff. So here's what I have found. And so this is, I'm going to just warn people, this is one of those places I always tell people is kind of counterintuitive, but when I explain it, it'll make sense to people. So the short answer is that the number doesn't matter. Whatever we got. So it doesn't really matter. But just to give people some data on this, so we've done this process with roughly 500 companies, and they range in industry from heavy construction, steel welding and fabricating, landscaping, to CPA firms, law firms, and medical practices. So it's not white collar or blue collar, it's just humans. So the fewest number of fundamentals I've ever seen in one of those companies, and this is going to surprise people, is 18. The most I've ever seen is 40. The sweet spot usually ends up somewhere in the 25 to 30 area. I would tell you that almost every one of those companies began the process by saying, I don't want to have any more than like 5 because you don't understand, this won't work for me.
Right.
None of those companies are saying that today. The conventional wisdom for why we should only have 3 or 4 or 5 is because people can't remember more than that.
Right.
And you're right. But here's the question I always ask. What's our goal? Is our goal to have something our people can recite, or is our goal to have people live the behaviors that drive success in our company? Obviously, it's the latter. And there's more than 5 behaviors that drive success. In my company, I happen to have 30. And I always challenge people, if you looked at my list of 30 behaviors or fundamentals and you only want to have 5, I would ask, so which 25 of these do you not want to be teaching in your company?
Yeah. And
you would have a really hard time. I mean, you might have 1 or 2 that don't resonate, but you would have a really hard time getting rid of 25 of them. The reason, by the way, that the number doesn't really matter, if you think about it, it goes back to the rituals. Whether you have 3 or 6 or 17 or 29, we're only going to take 1 at a time anyway, and we're going to focus on it intently, and then we're going to keep cycling through them over and over and over again. So there is an outer limit. If you had 320 of them, we'd never get back to the beginning.
Sure.
But outside of something silly, it doesn't really matter because we're only going to do 1 at a time anyway. And we're not going up to any of our people saying, Jeff, can you recite number 12? No, I don't need anybody to recite anything.
Right. It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. I just know that if we take 1 at a time and we focus on it intently, and then we keep cycling through them over and over and over again, sooner or later, they're going to be internalized by our people. That's why the number doesn't really matter.
Sure. Reciting doesn't matter.
Nope.
Doing matters.
Exactly. And you do them because they become internalized, and they become internalized because we teach them with enough repetition. Sure. There's a very simple illustration that might be helpful for your audience that I use in a lot of talks that I do to kind of distill this concept into its kind of simplest essence. And I think of it this way. If you want to get good at anything you want to get good at, whether we're talking about, I don't know, you want to learn to speak another language fluently, or you want to learn to be a master cabinet maker or concert pianist, or anything you want to master, other than, I always joke, other than golf, because that's just too frustrating. But anything else that you want to master, what do you have to do to master something? And everybody understands you have to practice a lot. You know, Malcolm Gladwell talks about the 10,000 hours it takes to master something. And I don't know if he's right. Who knows what the number is? It could be 9, it could be 12, but whatever it is, it's a lot. I could give you the best piano instructor the world's ever known, and that's not going to make you some concert pianist unless you spend thousands and thousands of hours working at it. So we all know that the only way we're going to get to master something is through tremendous amounts of practice. But here's the big question I always ask people. How many people do you know who love to do practice and repetition? Not many.
Not many.
We get bored. We hate it. Oh, do I got to keep practicing? So that's kind of a problem. If the only way we're ever going to master something is through lots and lots and lots of repetition, except most humans hate repetition, that's kind of a big deal. So what's the key to being able to do repetition? The key is rituals. Once something becomes a ritual, and I use that word almost interchangeably with the word habit. Some of your audience may have read, there's a couple of big bestsellers out there, The Power of Habit.
Sure.
There's another big book, Atomic Habits.
Yeah.
Same exact concept.
Right.
Once something becomes a routine, a ritual, a habit, it just becomes second nature. It's just what we do. Yeah. So the habit or the ritual is what's necessary to keep the repetition going. Because again, if we don't have the repetition, if we don't have the habit, we're just going to get bored and distracted and move on to something else. So the ritual is what's necessary to keep the repetition going, and the repetition is what's necessary in order to internalize something. So if we apply that thought very, very directly to culture, right? If driving a culture through your organization ultimately is nothing more complicated or fancier than getting your people to live and internalize the behaviors that you know will drive success in your company. That's all the culture is. Well, if we want our people to internalize those behaviors, they're not going to internalize them just because we had a big company meeting one day and we announced it to everybody.
Right.
They're not going to even internalize it because, you know, we put great posters up or we put them in their performance reviews. The only way they're ever going to internalize those behaviors is when we teach it to them over and 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 over again. And the only way we're ever going to do that with that much consistency without getting bored, distracted, and quitting is when we create rituals around it.
Sure. So let's talk about rituals. So I love what you said, that the number of fundamentals doesn't matter, the number of behaviors, but in general, most companies land in the 25 to 30 range.
That's correct.
Talk about rituals. How should we think about how many rituals one ought to try to build to support these and reinforce these behaviors?
That's a good question, Jeff. So I would say generally, more so than the number, what's important is that they be simple and easy to do. So when we talk about rituals, the more effort it takes, the less likely it's going to last. And so sometimes there's a tendency, oh, we got this great idea, we'll do this and this and this and this, and then it doesn't last. It's kind of like this is a little dated, but every company at one point or another, small company, has this idea that, well, I know what, let's create a newsletter and we'll all write articles for it and it'll be really good. And after 2 issues, we all quit because it got to be too much of a pain in the butt. And so if it's too much work, it's not going to last. Right. So as we think about building rituals, in terms of number, we don't need more than 1 or 2 or 3. And we want to keep them very simple. One of the principles that I encourage people to think about is, wherever possible, to the extent that you can leverage rituals that already exist in your company, this is easier. So if I use the example that I was giving of starting meetings with the fundamental of the week, we're not creating a new meeting. We're just leveraging the meeting you're already sitting in. This takes no extra time. You're already sitting there. Why don't we just take a couple minutes and we'll talk about the fundamental? That's pretty easy to do. Most companies have rituals. They may not use that language, but there's a cadence to how you run your business. Right. Every Tuesday is our sales meeting. Every Friday is our management meeting. There's a routine. Look first and ask yourself, what are we already doing in a ritualistic way? And is there a way I can fold a fundamental of the week discussion into what we're already doing?
Right.
Here's a really simple example. Most companies that I've worked with that are in construction or manufacturing fields, and you've probably seen this, it's very common that they do safety rituals. They often call them toolbox talks, or sometimes they call them tailgate talks, where on a job site, the guys and women they're at a construction site, and every single day, before the day starts, they do a 3 or 4 or 5 minute discussion of a safety topic. And it's very common in those industries. And so if I was a company like that, where every day we have a toolbox talk, I could just every Monday add 5 minutes to that and just fold in a fundamental of the week. I already have the ritual built.
Right.
Let me just tack on a few minutes to it and make it easy.
Right.
I think it's in Atomic Habits, I think it was in that book, the author talks about habit stacking, where if you can add something to what you're already doing, it's that much easier. Same kind of concept here.
Right.
Look first and ask, what do we already do in a ritualistic way, even if we don't use that language? And is there a way that I could fold this into what's already going on?
Right.
Easier is always better. The more work it takes, the less likely it's going to last.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Take the things that are already second nature and just modify them a little bit, add a little bit to it. David,
Exactly.
this has been a terrific conversation. We're going to post your contact information on the screen so folks can get in touch with you. What you've put together out of your own experience is extraordinarily rich and helpful and practical and intuitive. And you're right when you say, why didn't I think of this? Why didn't
it's so simple.
someone else think about it? But the impact on companies is significant based on the evidence that you have on your website and so forth. So thank you again for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Jeff.
And David Friedman of CultureWise, thank you.
You're welcome.
My buddy Steve. Yeah. Oh, my new member. Oh, awesome. So I had a guest in my meeting yesterday. Oh, my high school buddy. So I had a guest in my meeting yesterday. Oh, my high school buddy. Yeah, thanks. So I got oh, somebody just said we can hear your call. Oh, my mic is still live. Do I just end it, Paul?